GDPR, CRA, DMA, DSA, OSB. The regulation can seem pretty opaque for us mere mortals. But as a service provider open to the public, the Matrix.org Foundation cannot recklessly run a Synapse instance and just call it a day. It has duties and responsibilities. My guest today is Denise, who has many hats at the foundation. More particularly, she's DPO and Head of Policy and Compliance. She's here to talk about what it takes beyond tech to build, deploy, and run Matrix. I'm saying Matrix and not Matrix.org specifically because I'm talking about the protocol itself too. But we will see that running a public instance comes with a responsibility even for individuals or informal organizations. More particularly, we're going to see why the foundation needs a compliance person, and we're going to talk about the foundation's plan for the upcoming year. Denise, welcome. Can you remind us what a DPO does, especially in the context of Matrix?
Yeah, so DPO, so for those that are not familiar with the acronym, it is a data protection officer. This is a mandated role by the GDPR. Again, if you're not familiar, it's the General Data Protection Regulation. So lots of acronyms coming. And a data protection officer is essentially the person responsible for compliance with data protection regulation within your organization. So this person has to maintain records, maintain all of our different policies, procedures, also advise other teams and other parts of any organization on how to do things properly from a data protection point of view, and also engage with both the regulator and also with people. So in many cases, the DPO is the person that acts as the gateway between the general public, the organization, and then also the regulator when it's necessary. So in a lot of cases, it tends to be a person that talks to everyone within your organization, that just tends to be involved in everything, and also tries to remain fairly neutral in most cases, just so it's not a conflict of interest to the role. So really, most things, privacy, data protection, fall under this role. In the case of Matrix, there's also a very big research part for this because, and we'll talk about it a bit more in, I think, in this video, but the GDPR and all of these regulations are not really written for the sort of technology that we're building. It's very focused on centralized systems and more traditional technology. So in our case, we have to do a lot of research, we have to do a lot of thinking and making decisions that not everyone is going to agree to, not everyone is going to agree with our interpretation. And we're always open to that feedback and that conversation, but it's not as simple as, oh, this is what we need to do. It's very straightforward. So there's a lot of stretching the boundaries of what our interpretations can be and what we can actually do.
All right. So for me, the DPO was basically the person you reach out to when you want to exercise your GDPR rights. Like, oh, you need to give me my data and delete my data. This is what I thought the DPO was about, but there is a lot more involved. What are the other recurring activities that keep you busy at the foundation?
Yeah. So one of the things that is probably not the most exciting, but is really, really important, is make sure that we keep good records. So keeping our records of processing activities, because that is kind of our foundation for everything. We need to know where our data lives. We need to know what systems it's in, what potential third parties it communicates. Because when someone does come and ask us, where's my data? Can I get access to it? We need to know, and we need to be able to do this fairly quickly and efficiently. So that's one of the things that I do a lot, is keep these internal records. They're always in a state of flow. I always try to say that compliance is really a journey. We're never 100% compliant, because as soon as something changes, like we get a new supplier or we change a process, that means we have to revisit our compliance related to that process. So there's a lot of continuous work when it comes to maintaining our records. When it comes to engaging with people that do reach out to us and reach out to dpo@matrix.org, some people want access to their data. Some people just want to ask questions about how their data is processed and handled. And that's completely fair. Sometimes we have questions that are so good that leads us to update our privacy policy and make sure that everyone has that same information. So it's a very interactive role, both within the organization and then also communicating with the rest of the community. And then there's loads of other things like answering questions, and people might want to do something new that's never been done before. So I get to go through those conversations and learn something new, which is really exciting as well. And then we have to keep an eye on loads of other things like, are there breaches that we have to notify, or are we doing something that could have high risks? So we have to do data protection impact assessment. So it's a lot of different areas of the regulation that definitely keeps me busy.
Right. The thing with the foundation is it has both the blessing and the curse of being a small organization, and it's also very open source centric. And small organizations and open source projects have the same bias to action. And basically, people try to do things, and then you have the compliance people saying, "No, no, 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 come." So, thank you for your patience and bearing with us, because I know we are a bunch of not mean but troublesome people who just like to get things done. Um, we, you have mentioned that a bit earlier, but you said you are doing regulatory landscape monitoring. So, what are you monitoring, and why? Why is it relevant to Matrix?
So it's mainly monitoring what is happening in terms of the main markets that are important to us. So that is essentially the EU, the UK, and the US. Um, Mainly, that's where most of our user base is. That's where most of the Matrix deployments, communities are. But also because these regulations, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on what your thoughts are, they tend to be very influential. Um, I'm not going to get into the weeds of it, but there's actually a term for it called the Brussels effect, where a lot of times when there's a new big piece of regulation coming from the EU, this tends to have a bit of a trickle effect in other markets. We saw that with the GDPR, where the GDPR passed in 2016, and since then, at least 10 other countries have passed very, very similar regulations. Um, and that's because these regulations tend to ask for a territorial scope that says, well, you can be anywhere in the world, but if you're touching European data, you have to comply with this. So it's very much that effect that makes things progress in other territories. So this is why I really focus on the EU, UK, and to a lesser degree, US. What am I monitoring? Basically, whatever's coming out in terms of new regulation that could have high impacts for us, but also what is happening in terms of enforcement of existing regulation, because that creates case law that in many cases could influence our decisions. So in terms of decentralized and federated technology, there's hardly any case law. There's hardly any opinions by official supervisory boards. I think there's a couple of opinions on Mastodon, and that's essentially it. So I'm always trying to learn what might be coming out in terms of opinions that could help us in our own compliance journey, but also trying to understand what new pieces of regulation are going to come our way that could have an impact on the foundation, on the protocol, or the wider ecosystem. So yeah, just obviously full transparency. I also work for Element, so I am looking at this from both a element perspective and what are the impacts on a commercial organization, but also from a Matrix Foundation perspective and what are the impacts on a not-for-profit organization. So it's very focused on the digital privacy space, and that's why there's all of these lovely acronyms that you mentioned at the start of the call are all somewhat related to this work.
And of course, this work does not conflict, because a lot of the work that you do for the for-profit element also benefits the organization, the non-profit Matrix Foundation, and the other way around. So it makes a lot of sense to have you on both activities.
Yeah.
You told me that you are mostly monitoring what is happening in the UK, US, and EU. Are there some fields of the regulation that are excluded from what you are monitoring? I guess you are not monitoring agricultural, for example, regulation. It doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, definitely not. I'm very focused on digital regulation and competition. So the DMA is kind of an overlap between digital and a competition regulation. That one is very impactful, for example, on the element side of things, as you can imagine, because it's meant to drive innovation and competition within the EU. But then there's the other angle that is also really important for the foundation around requiring interoperability as a default thing for gatekeepers, which is really significant because it's very aligned with the mission of the foundation of making sure that everyone can communicate with anyone, regardless of the system that they might be trapped in. So those are definitely the areas that I'm focused on, is very much on digital rights, digital economy, and competition, as that's what's really, really impactful for us. So if we go through like them really, really quickly, you see the GDPR is focused on information rights, in our case, in the digital space. Then you have the CRA, which is very much focused on cyber resilience. So it's very impactful for us in terms of open source and what we will be able to do in the future, what will be the impacts for the foundation. So this one is a bit of an outlier from the ones that I tend to monitor. And then we have things like the DMA and the DSA, which are the digital services package of the EU, which is really, really significant. And then the Online Safety Act in the UK has been very controversial. So I'm sure everyone has heard about this one. And that's focus on digital rights in the whole and digital monitoring. So those are the ones that I tend to focus on and then exclude pretty much everything else. But this is the sort of work you don't really do alone. So I do keep track of what others are doing, what other organizations are paying attention to, like the EFF, like EDRI, like all of these org in the UK. These organizations have incredible people. So I also keep an eye, and if they start talking about something that I haven't paid attention, I'm always like, what is this? And then go and try to figure out, could this have an impact on us? So it's not really a static thing where I'm like, oh no, I'm never going to look at that piece of regulation.
So Matrix is a bit of a special beast in the sense that it's federated, and you mentioned earlier that Mastodon was another of the outliers because it's a federated system, and it's getting quite popular these days. And I'm saying outliers because the regulation tends to be for non-federated systems. Why do you reckon that regulators focus so much on centralized systems?
Because it's just what's common. So without going too far deep into this, regulation is always built as trying to catch up with technology. So if we think about the first pieces of data protection regulation, so we're going back, if we go back to like the 50s and the right to privacy being instituted as a human right, and then we go from that to actual pieces of regulation and data protection. The first ones were focused on filing systems like filing cabinets and telephony and that sort of thing, because that was the existing technology. We then move on into the ones that were written in the 90s. Then we start hearing about floppy disks, and we start hearing about email systems and that sort of thing, where it's still very, very, very centralized. Now the GDPR came to be, was published in 2016. The work on it started much before that, and it was very much an attempt at being as neutral as possible in terms of technology, but they were still operating within the paradigm of the time. And the paradigm of the time is that mainly we have centralized systems. We mainly live in a world where most organizations will have Active Directory, they will have their centralized, they'll have a server or they'll have a cloud-based server. And that is just the reality for the majority of organizations. So even though they tried to turn it really neutral in terms of technology and who it applies to, it was still written with this very traditional system in mind. And that is just not the sort of things that we are building here. The reality is that most things do still apply to us because they are purposely vague and they try to future-proof as much as they could. but then there's a few things that it's really hard to agree. So there's one thing in the GDPR and a few clauses that it's around technical difficulties where you don't necessarily have to comply with certain things because of how technically difficult it would be. And if you think about it, everything would be really technically difficult for us, but we can't use that as an excuse because we are choosing to build technology in this way. So where is the line of when can we actually use this exemption and say, actually, this has not been built for us, we really can't do it, versus, oh, we just don't want to do it. Not to say that we go down that route often, but or at all, but it's just to say that it's not that the regulators are out to get us or that the policymakers are not keen to hear about decentralization or federation. It's just really, what is the proportion of the economy? What is the proportion of organizations that is doing this? And at the time it was written, it was even less than today. So I think it's just the nature of the rhythms of technology evolving, regulation evolving, always trying to catch up. So I would expect that future iterations of data protection regulation would consider this the same way that we're not seeing the DMA and the DSA talking about interoperability, talking about decentralization and federation, because it's been written a lot more recently. So I'm sure it will be a natural evolution.
So chances are high that the regulation will adapt if we get enough of the market share, and we are getting a lot of market share, especially in the public sector. So it's very important to have policy and compliance people like you on board. Do you have some successes of the past year in terms of advocacy in mind?
So it depends on how you define success. I would say that a lot of the work that was done around the UK online safety bill and the Online Safety Act was really successful, even though the bill still passed with a few things that we didn't necessarily agree with. But it managed to unite a lot of people and a lot of organizations that wouldn't necessarily banded together in the past, but we realized like this is something really important, and I would say that that is a huge success that we were able to work together, move forward, and try to advocate for what really matters at the end of the day, and what matters at the end of the day is people, and making sure that their rights are protected, that if they think their communications are private and secure, then they should be. And I think that's really what matters at the end of the day. Obviously, everything coming out of the DMA as well, and it becoming true, Meta now having an interoperability center is something that we wouldn't really have seen a couple of years ago or even dreamed of. So although there's still a lot to go, there's still a lot of work to do for this to actually fulfill the wishes and the promises of this law. I would still call that a big win. But there's, I don't know, I feel like a compliance person, our perspective is that it's just never ending the journey. So it's really hard to think about like what are the wins, what are the successes. But I think we're just from an internal perspective, we're really becoming more robust, more mature, and in our approach and the decisions we make internally in terms of compliance, but also when we think it's important to be loud, or when we think it's important to actually try to talk to policymakers directly and trying to make them see our point. I don't necessarily think that being loud is always the most appropriate. And I know sometimes our community has been a bit upset with us because they thought we should be a bit louder than we have been. And it's not to say we're not working on things. And I think that's a really that's a win from in my book, is to be at a maturity level of our advocacy and our work, that we can apply different strategies to different pieces of regulation, to different topics, and do what we think is the most effective and will benefit the most people. So it's not very exciting answer, but I'm proud of what we've achieved so far.
I really disagree that it's not exciting. It might be because I'm not just a technical person, and I really care about all the organizational aspects of it. But I find it very exciting that we have the maturity to organize, to prioritize, to rally with others, and to set up effective campaigns to make sure that we are at least heard. And sometimes a bill passing, but less worse than it was supposed to be, is already a win. Not necessarily
Yeah.
the greatest victory, but congrats. I mean, it's really good work here. And I really want to highlight that it's important work, especially because it's invisible. Most of the time, it's working behind the scenes, and it's not those big explosions and those big success or new products, but it's a lot of work, and it's very, very needed, especially because of the wide impact it has. Regulation applies to everyone, so
Yeah.
making sure that the regulation works in a direction that allows us to do good work and that works for people is a huge win in my book. Um, Beyond those successes for the last year, what are you preparing for the next year?
So this year, again, we're really focused on this maturity journey. If you've been following our matrix.org legal documents, if you're so inclined over the last few years, you've seen that they've changed and shifted a lot over the past few years. We've been doing a lot of work in completely revamping our matrix.org home server terms, our website terms, our privacy policy, to obviously comply with all of these new regulations, but also to make them more accessible, clear, so that anyone can understand them. And our hope as well is that other open source organizations that might take inspiration from it, they'll just be able to use it as a template. So we very much, our focus will be to mature our processes, continue working, but we also want to start giving back, and start sharing a lot of our thinking and a lot of our work with other communities. So one thing will be in terms of providing templates, providing suggestions. Obviously, never legal advice, because we will not do that, and I am not a lawyer. But we will try our best to help other communities, especially those that are providing home servers, that are helping their communities, and they just don't have the ability, the resources to hire a DPO or to get this sort of support. This is something that applies to a lot of communities, and a lot of people won't even know that they have these sorts of responsibilities. So we just want to provide as much education as we can. And also, we'll start pretty soon a blog series on all of these things in a bit more detail. So you should expect a blog post out maybe next week. I'm not sure. We need to agree on that. And yeah, we will try to go in a bit more detail on our thinking, our plans, and ask for feedback as well. Like, there's things that we keep getting stuck on, and I don't know, you might have the solution out there. And I think we need to be a bit more open and transparent with the community on these things. So that's where I'll be focused on for the next year.
Yeah, and I'm really excited for those blog posts because it's going to give a lot of visibility on all the work that is happening behind the scenes, and hopefully get more people involved. Why not? As well as the what you mentioned, providing templates, because it's easy to think that it just takes somebody who can barely manage a server to set up a service online and get it running, and that's it. But even as an individual, if you have open registrations, or as an informal organizations, you can get yourself in trouble if you are not doing things properly. So I'm really excited to see how we can help people do things properly, always in that spirit of decentralization, and making sure that people don't rely on the Matrix.org Foundation and Matrix.org home server. Is there anything we forgot to mention?
I would say that a lot of this work is not done in isolation. There's a lot done in parallel with my colleagues in legal, with colleagues in trust and safety. So a lot of these things are a team effort and not something we can ever do alone. So if you are doing this sort of work and you're feeling a bit overwhelmed, reach out to other people and ask for help. This type of work is not meant to be done in isolation. So yeah, I want to give a huge shout out to my colleagues that, again, we're constantly trying to find solutions for completely different and new scenarios that we haven't found in the past. Also to say that I'm really excited for the Trust and Safety Working Group to be set up, because policy is evolving, but so are the tools. And we're working very close together to make sure that the ecosystem, that people's safety and privacy keeps improving. So I'm really looking forward for that to be in place as well.
Okay, thank you very much. If that's everything, I'll see you around and see you next
Yeah,
week,
thank
Matrix
you.
Live. See you.
Bye.